Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I'm delighted that our next guest I'm delighted he's alive. And that might sound dramatic. It might sound a bit sensationalist, but it isn't. I'm delighted he's alive because when he went to prison this time last year, I feared we might never hear of him again. Now, I mentioned at the top of the programme, he's a barrister, former barrister. He's an author. He wrote a terrific book, very interesting, very entertaining book called Spy Hunters, The Secret History of German Intelligence. When I say entertaining, I'm in no way patronising the book or the content. A lot of what was in the book was true. Very interesting book. Really interesting book, and I recommend it. It's available on amazon.co.uk right now. But he's an expert in the workings and in the field of intelligence. And he has been for a long time. And I've spoken to him on previous radio and television shows about intelligence matters. I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, he was sentenced to a year in prison last year for allegedly making a hoax phone call to the Ministry of Defence months before the 2012 Olympics in London. They alleged that he claimed that Nazi spies, and this is the way it was reported in the media anyway, I wasn't in court, Michael represented himself, that Nazi spies had taken a nuclear warhead from the Kursk submarine, which of course famously sunk some years ago, and that they were intending on detonating it in London. Now, rather than me express any opinions on this, because my opinions are not valid, they're not interesting, and you're not here to hear them, let's welcome back to the programme our friend and previous guest, Michael Shrimpton. Michael, welcome back. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, thanks, Richie. It's kind of you to give me a good introduction, and delighted to be on the programme, and quite pleased still to be alive.
You see, I wasn't being dramatic. Some of our listeners will say that's very sensationalist. Now he's building this up into nothing. When you think about what you had revealed through Spy Hunter and through interviews you'd given around the world to various radio programmes about what was going on in the upper echelons of politics and big business with children, and when you all of that with the attempts to suppress a real investigation into elite paedophilia, yeah, I feared that we were going to learn that you'd killed yourself in prison. I really did.
Yes. Certainly I had some concerns, but fortunately I wasn't even assaulted. In fact, the only suicide attempt in my cell was by my suicidal South Korean cellmate, and I had to cut him down. So that was the only suicide incident whilst I was there. I'm glad to say he survived, and he was very promptly sent to hospital, where he probably should have been all along. I won't give his name because I made a very firm rule not to give the names of prisoners I shared accommodation with, although I will be in due course writing a book about my experiences, which will not be like Spy Hunter. It won't be an intelligence text. It will be not a light-hearted book, but it will be more aimed at the general reader. How
did you get on in jail? I mean, you're a guy who, you've done well for yourself in life. You're an educated man. You've led a good life. You're not unacquainted or not unfamiliar with the finer things in life. All this happens. How did you cope with that? What was it like being in jail?
Well, it was certainly an interesting experience, and yes, it was not what I was used to. I've stayed in 5-star hotels. My favorite hotel in Washington is the Willard, and I have flown Concorde a couple of times, and not unused to traveling first class and business class. So yes, it was a little bit of a shock to the system, but I'm a barrister. I still am a barrister. I haven't yet put my wig and gown on eBay. I haven't yet been disbarred. I might be, but that's entirely a matter for the disciplinary tribunal, which may convene or may not convene later in the year. It wasn't my first time in prison because although I wasn't a criminal lawyer as such, I certainly had done a number of criminal trials, and in the course of my intelligence practice, at least one of my spy clients was locked up on a totally bogus charge. So I wasn't unused to visiting prisons. It wasn't a totally new experience for me, but it is, of course, rather different as a lawyer visiting your client in prison and going home at the end of the day being banged up overnight. The first night in prison is always the most difficult when the door clangs shut for the first time. I certainly noticed that, but I didn't burst into tears. I got myself, went down to the library, got some good books, and enjoyed catching up on reruns of Minder and The Professionals. I never had time to see it before. There were only in TV. In prison, you only get a very limited number of TV channels. I'm sorry to say that there are no. You cannot get Sky Sports.
You don't get the cricket, basically. There's no cricket in prison.
Very, very upset about that, Richie. I have to say, if we're going to bang up cricket lovers in prison, if you're going to put upper middle class cricket-loving barristers in prison, then the least you can do is arrange to have Sky Sports.
Do you hear that big silence there? That's the lack of sympathy from a lot of our listeners now. There's tumbleweed blowing across the studio here.
Well, exactly. It's certainly given me an interest in prison reform. I won't say for the first time, because I used to be a member of Liberty, and I started out on the left. I was a Labour candidate, and prison reform was one of the issues that I was interested in. And a friend of mine, Ann Owers, became Director General of Prisons. That was quite a good one. I always taken the view that prison is, generally speaking, sufficient punishment in itself, and one measure of the civilized nature of a society is the way in which it treats its prisoners. So
absolutely.
I wasn't one of those I wasn't a Tory. I'm now a Tory and have been since '97. I'm not one of those Tories that bangs on about making life difficult for prisoners, and I'm rather glad, having gone through the experience myself, I'm rather glad that I was sympathetic to the plight of prisoners before.
Good stuff. Let's not privatise them either. The most serious decision a society can make is to lock somebody up, so that should be prisoners should be in the care of the state, not in the care of for-profit corporations. But that's another debate we could have another time.
We could. I have to tell you, most prisoners who've been through, I was interested to hear from prisoners who had been transferred into state-run prisons from private-run prisons. By and large, they will go for if they're given an option, most prisoners will go for the private-run prisoners. You get telephones in your cell there.
Right, well, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I'll bear that in mind. I'm going to be talking about that at length in future programmes. Before we start talking about why this happened to you, because I have a theory about why it happened to you, and I've read the case and followed the case back to front, top to bottom. Did you contact the Ministry of Defence to tell them that you had evidence that German intelligence or Nazi spies were going to detonate a bomb in London?
Well, actually, no. A Ministry of Defence contacted me. This was the world's first ring-back bomb hoax. It's one of the reasons why I have always asserted the charges were a total nonsense. Nobody's ever been charged before with a bomb hoax for an incoming hoax call. Almost by definition, since it was an incoming call, I had given my number. What happened was this. I was passed intelligence from a man named Neil Jones in Kent, with whom I'd collaborated on a number of issues successfully. Between us, we'd had a number of intelligence successes. Neil Jones passed intelligence to me from Ben Fulford in Tokyo. Now, I had never dealt directly with Ben, but Neil had, and Neil used to monitor his website. And there was a little group of computer scientists in Cambridge with whom Neil was in touch. He himself is a computer scientist, patronized severely by the police and the prosecution. And I had no doubt at the time that Neil had passed stuff to me in good faith. He'd never dealt with me in bad faith before, never dealt with me in bad faith at all. I had no doubt about Ben Fulford's good faith. I still don't. And I knew that Ben Fulford had accurately predicted the 3/11 attack at Fukushima. So this was the one man in the world who could truthfully claim to say that he had anticipated a nuclear attack and had warned the authorities, had been ignored, and the attack went ahead. It actually happened. And I knew from the seismic records, which I had looked at prior to 2012, I knew the seismic records showed that Fukushima was inconsistent with a naturally occurring earthquake followed by a tsunami. So the intelligence is coming from a well-placed source in Tokyo, known to have connections to the CIA, Japanese intelligence, the Japanese imperial household, and the Japanese government, and also known to have a source codenamed Sorge, who was close to the Russian GRU. Sorge is a Serb, at least uses Serbian identity papers, and he is someone who is thought to be close to the GRU in Moscow. Now, the then director of the GRU, Major General Igor Sergin, he and I had never met, but Igor and I had a number of mutual friends. And, of course, I had been invited into the Kremlin. Strictly, it was the Felix Dzerzhinsky's old office outside the Kremlin walls, but it was the President's administration, that popularly known as the Kremlin. The Kremlin had invited me in for a chat in 2005, and I was in Moscow. So I was known to Russian intelligence, known to the GRU, and my name would have been known to Igor, who was a very nice man and very able. And it didn't particularly surprise me that the intelligence would come through a route that was bound to lead to me, and nobody in Moscow or Tokyo could possibly suppose that if I had intelligence which I thought was credible about a threat to the life of the Queen and a threat to blow up potentially 100,000 people at a sporting event, nobody could suppose for one moment that I would sit on intelligence which I thought might be credible. I contacted but this didn't happen overnight. Neil Jones contacted me initially by voicemail, and the voicemail was getting increasingly frantic. I had just got back into England from writing Spy Hunter. I was setting up my barrister's practice. As soon as I was available for hire, as it were, like the yellow light going on the cab, I had solicitors ringing me. Work was piling up. I had a potential appearing in the Court of Appeal that week, which didn't go ahead, but I had to do the paperwork for it. I had an injunction that somebody wanted me to do in the county court. I had an insolvency matter. I had a hearing in front of the insolvency registrar in the High Court. I had a High Court libel matter. There were 3 or 4.
You were busy. There was a lot going on.
I was busy,
right,
yeah.
Okay.
The last thing I wanted was to get involved in another new cunt. I wasn't set up at all to deal with operational intelligence matters. I was in a new flat. I was still furnishing the flat. I didn't even have a proper telephone. People ask me, well, why didn't you record the conversation? Well, of course I would have recorded the conversation if I was set up to do the thing properly. But
because ordinarily you would have been. Is that what you're telling me? Yeah.
Oh,
but you were new to the property, so you weren't set up to do it.
In my old house, which when I started to do operational intelligence work, I ceased practicing from chambers because my conferences are being bugged by the CIA with laser microphones. It was nonsensical. My old house was actually very secure. It was electronically swept. The flat hadn't been swept. I didn't know if there were any bugs in it or not. My old house was electronically swept. It was a secure environment. There were very few visitors. I had an office which had cost me the best part of £20,000 to furnish. With an array of telephones. It was like a mini operations center. I had certainly had the ability to record calls and several lines, including effectively a red line that could be preserved for emergencies. And it was reserved for emergencies. I had, heavy-duty fax machines and
right. I'm getting the picture. Yeah.
All the kit I needed, and of course, also I had thousands of direct dial numbers. I had internal telephone directories for the Pentagon and the White House. And if I needed to put a call through to the Pentagon, I could look it up at a direct. If I was dealing with someone I hadn't dealt with before, I could usually get their direct dial number. Ditto for the White House. Ditto for the State Department. I had direct dial numbers for Moscow. Most of my direct dial numbers in 2012 were still in storage, Richie. I mean, they were stuck out in Australia.
Yeah.
And
because I want to move this along now because of where we're going and because of the time, right? So keep an eye on the clock because we know exactly how long we have together.
You're politely telling me I'm rambling. It is a fault of mine.
Well, you're a barrister, and why use 6 words when you can use 100, right?
Well, exactly. That's very well. You're doing very well to draw me out of my shell. But
Thank
the
you.
last thing, to cut a long story short, the last thing in the world I wanted was to get involved in a new cunt. But nuclear weapons, the trouble with nuclear weapons is they're very loud and they're very noisy. And when they go off with a big boom. And you can't really ignore intelligence about a nuke being in London. You can't ignore intelligence about a nuke being anywhere, frankly. There was no option. It had to be dealt with.
You tipped them off and they came back to you to get more information on it.
Exactly. A man named Barry Burton, who was the private secretary to the Secretary of State for Defense, rang me back on a number I had provided to the Secretary of State's office in the House of Commons. The and I gave him a briefing which lasted over 20 minutes. He then claimed it was a hoax call. Well, I have to tell you, most Ministry of Defence civil servants wouldn't spend 20, 25 minutes on a hoax call. He told me that he would take it to the Secretary of State that evening. He didn't. In fact, and this is common ground, this is the evidence he gave at trial, he rang the Cabinet Office. Now, it's also common ground that he destroyed the notes of my briefing. There was then a second note, which was, with respect to Mr. Burton, quite inaccurate. It was garbled, in fact. But that was the note on which I was prosecuted. Before the police were brought in, the Ministry of Defence, I'm not necessarily blaming Mr. Burton. In fact, it wasn't his decision. I know full well it wasn't. Before the police were called in, the Ministry of Defence destroyed every piece of evidence in their possession about what I had actually said. The initial voicemail was wiped. The notes, as I've explained to your listeners, the notes of my briefing made by Mr. Burton were destroyed.
Now, did the judge not care about this, hearing the case?
Oh, no, I'm afraid the learned judge, with the greatest respect, wasn't troubled in the slightest.
Wasn't bothered by it?
No, I mean, I raised the issue of abuse of process. He wasn't in the least bit troubled, nor, I'm afraid, with the Court of Appeal. It wasn't even referred to in the Court of Appeal's judgment. And there's no dispute about it. He said he thought what happened is that between arrest and trial, I had conversations with a retired agent of the National Security Agency. Indeed, I'd been in direct contact with the NSA. The NSA eventually sent along a very nice retired, in inverted commas, officer who had lunch with me and a prosecution witness at the prosecution witness's invitation at a very nice hotel in Bury St Edmunds. This NSA officer had previously been based nearby at not a million miles away in the NSA GCHQ facility at RAF Minwith Hill.
Right.
Now, the very nice man from Minwith, as I shall refer to him, and a very nice prosecution witness who was an intelligence officer of a considerable distinction. And I had a conversation, and this was then followed by another lunch between the same witness, myself, and Dr. Jerry Corsi, my fellow intelligence author in the United States. The Ministry of Defence were obviously made aware that I was in contact with NSA. I suspect that Mr. Burton was briefed prior to giving evidence that Shrimpton is in contact with the Americans. He may well have an intercepted copy of the facts when we faxed the notes over to the Cabinet Office. You had better tell the truth. It may well be, in fairness to Mr. Burton, that he is a man inclined to tell the truth anyway. Whether he is or whether he isn't, he did tell the truth and certainly admitted on record to have destroyed having destroyed the first set of notes.
But Michael, there was no injured party here. Here's a guy. Look, let's just say you are a crackpot. Let's just say you are, right? I don't think you are, but let's just say you are. How can the state show injury? How can they show loss of earning, loss of money? So a guy says to them, listen, I'm hearing this on the grapevine, through the intelligence channels, I'm hearing this bit of disturbing news. They call you back, you have a 20-minute conversation, the guy takes notes, he goes away. Now, they didn't then commit a mass squad of people to invade the subways and the undergrounds of London. They didn't spend any money, they didn't panic anybody, nobody gave a damn. How could they show any justifiable reason to want to prosecute you for that, whether you were right or wrong, or whether you were a crackpot or not?
There was no loss.
Right. No loss to anybody.
Yeah, the intelligence is not investigated by the MOD. What I, of course, had asked for was for the intelligence to be verified. I took it seriously, but it was only intelligence. It hadn't yet been verified. We were at the intelligence gathering stage. We needed to move, in my opinion, to the verification stage. And what I recommended, respectfully, to MOD was that we get an E3 Sentry into the air with radiation detection kit. Now, I had been tipped off by a friend of mine, Air Marshal Sir John Walker. John, who used to chair the Deputy Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, former Director General of Intelligence, very well-informed man. John hinted when we spoke, I rang him at home, obviously I had his home number. We spoke first on a mobile, the signal was poor. He later said in evidence, I think, that his phone was not working terribly well. I rang him at home the following morning at about 9 o'clock, and we had a long conversation, which shows up on the phone logs. And John, I think we spoke for about 20 minutes. John hinted that the RAF had some fairly new kit, which would be just the ticket for checking whether or not there was a covert nuclear device, which would obviously be shielded by lead or boron or another radiation-absorbing material. And knowing that, suspecting strongly that John was right, I recommended to MOD, said, look, we need to get a sentry into the air quietly, the opposite of a bomb hoax. We need to do this quietly. It should be done in the early hours of the morning. Nobody will notice. It's another aircraft over London. Boeing 707 is a converted airliner anyway. Nobody's going to know it's a sentry. We just get it over London at the right height.
And you can see if it's there or not.
Exactly, see what's there. Now,
not much of a cost to anybody. Could have been done pretty easily.
Exactly.
Yes, something is there, or no, Shrimpton is mad. Leave it at that.
Well, exactly. And the sentries have to fly so many hours a year anyway. So if there was nothing there, you would just put it down as a training flight.
Can I ask you this? Because we are going to move this along now. We're going to start talking now about why this really happened, why I think it happened, and I think why you suspect it happened. When did you realise that this was getting very serious? Was it actually during the case? Because I know in the early stages of this case, you represented yourself. They often say that the man who represents himself is a fool for a client. But you were pretty of attorneys. But you're a pretty learned barrister. You're a smart enough guy to do it. Yeah, you're a barrister. You can do it for yourself. So when, and then I want to wrap this up. Then, when did you realise? Hang on a second, Mike. Something serious going on here.
Well, to be perfectly frank, I really didn't think that the case would ever get as far as it did. It was such obvious nonsense. I thought it would be blocked. The attorney, I went to the Attorney General. I spoke to the Attorney General about it, Dominic Grieve. He's a nice chap. He's no offence intended. He's not a terribly good lawyer. I mean, he thinks factor is rightly decided. It's a nice chap, but not. And nobody would say, including himself, that he was the most distinguished of lawyers. I went to Dominic and bumped into Dominic at the bar conference and said, well, look, you ought to have a look at this. I'm going to apply to you to stop the trial and enter a nulla prosequi. He should have done that. Clearly, he should have done that. But, of course, he wasn't in control of the prosecution. The CPS is controlled from the Cabinet Office. And the Cabinet Office had clearly targeted me, and perhaps no surprise, because I had identified the Savile paedophile ring as having been run out of the Cabinet Office. And John Hunt, the then Cabinet Secretary, the late John Hunt, as being one of the persons to whom Savile was supplying teenage boys for abuse. So the Cabinet Office had clearly marked me. It was the Cabinet Office who told MOD to destroy the notes. As far as I know, the Ministry of Defence did not destroy any evidence of my briefing until they had spoken to the Cabinet Office. The timeline, I think, is clear on that. Although I was astonished to be arrested on the following day and assumed this was an almighty cock-up, and told the police to get through to the Director General of MI5 and the Chief Constable ASAP. And although the whole process dragged on for 2 years, I never really thought either we get to trial. If we get to trial, I couldn't see how we could get past half-time. The trial, with great respect, was unfair, and I say that with great respect to the learned trial judge. I am going to the European Court of Human Rights. And I am challenging the fairness of the trial in the proper forum, which is Strasbourg. The trial was not Article 6 compliant. I was prevented from completing my evidence. The jury were nobbled. GO2, the German operation in London, got through to the jury. Intelligence community was able to verify that because, of course, the jury, as soon as the jury mentioned my name in a phone call, that would automatically be picked up as my name is a key word. And
so you believe the jury was tampered with?
Oh, the jury was tampered with.
You really believe that? Right.
Oh, yes. That is the view of the intelligence community. The jury were clearly tampered with. The problem is that without the evidence, without the phone transcripts, I couldn't...
So your extensive contacts, and I, from speaking to you over a number of years now and listening to what you've had to say, so much of it adds up. Yeah, I believe that you do have extensive intelligence contacts. So they tell you, you've been stitched up, mate. The jury have been got to, basically.
Yeah, well, yes, the learned trial judge, I was trying to make the point to the jury that I have extensive intelligence contacts.
You're not in any danger now of being held in contempt of court for saying this, are you?
No, the trial is over. It's not contempt of court to say you haven't had a fair trial, if that is your opinion.
But about the jury tampering, that might be something else entirely, no?
No, the jury tampering may feature in the Strasbourg case. It's not a contempt of court to tell the truth. That is my opinion, that the jury were tampered with. That is the opinion. It's widely shared within the intelligence community. The evidence may yet be introduced. If the evidence is put in my hands, then I will take the point in a formal way. But I'm entitled to state my view. And my view is the jury were tampered with.
Well, we will follow your appeals obviously very closely. I'm going to pause now for a 90-second break. We've got Michael Shrimpton on the line, folks. Check out Michael's book, Spy Hunter. It's available at all good bookshops. I've seen it in Manchester recently. It's on sale and you'll get it online as well. A terrific read, intriguing, entertaining, as I said, shocking at times. But that's Michael's book. He's a barrister. I said retired only because he hasn't, obviously, because of his situation. He's not practiced. He's not, overseen or worked on cases for a while. But he is, in my opinion, a verifiable even expert on all matters intelligence. And he's got connections in intelligence agencies around the world. And when we come back, we're going to be getting into why he feels and why I suspect this happened to him. Because when you listen to what we just spoke about for the last 25 minutes and how this came about, it is an absolute nonsense that a man would be sent to prison for that. So why was he sent to prison? Michael Shrimpton will stay with us. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back with more in 90 seconds.
Have you lost access to important data from a computer hard drive, mobile phone or other storage device? Maybe you have a broken hard drive containing years of information, or a smartphone that no longer works from which you'd like the pictures, movies and chats recovered. If you would like to recover data from any type of digital device, including desktop and laptop computers, external hard drives, cameras, smartphones, NAS and RAID servers, then contact Data Clinic today at dataclinic.co.uk now.
NeonNettle.com, a new voice in alternative media. For unfiltered news at your fingertips, visit NeonNettle.com, the UK's #1 alternative news site, in association with The Richie Allen Show. NeonNettle.com.
Do you want to release the full potential of your soul consciousness and find out how to experience that power in all areas of your life now? Go to livingasyoursoul.com for free guidance with in-depth how-to articles, free healing meditations of creation recordings, free soul solutions, and much, much more. livingasyoursoul.com, making the profound practical.
Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Welcome back to the programme. It's 2 minutes to the top of the hour. We're not going to take news at the top of the hour, so stick around. Michael Shrimpton is our guest. He's our only guest this Tuesday, February the 9th, 2016. His licence has just expired. He's free to talk, and he has been talking about his experiences of prison, the trial, the farcical charges brought against him, ultimately going to prison for a hoax when the Ministry of Defence had contacted him, had called him back to ask him about his sources and the information that he had about a possible nuclear attack on the City of London. Now, whatever you might think about that, whatever you might think about Michael's bona fides, whether he's genuine or not, whether he's real or not, it's an absolute outrage that anybody would be sent to prison for that. Michael, thanks for staying with me. So why were you sent to prison for this then? You know what my theory is, and I've said it on the programme for pretty much the last 12 months when this subject has come up. It's my contention that because of some of the things you've been saying and some of the intelligence you've been sharing about what former prime ministers of this country and others have been getting up to over the years, some of the things you said about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, which we probably won't get into here, I think that a lesson was being dealt, or a lesson was being taught to you, but more importantly to others who would talk about people like Edward Heath and others and what they were getting up to. I believe you were being targeted. What say you?
I hear what you say and have nothing to add.
But you do have something to add. You were being targeted, right?
I was being targeted, clearly, yes. In fact, the police seized my book. When I was arrested, I was told that officers were on their way to interview me. That was complete nonsense. They didn't interview me till about 8 hours later. I was left to stew in Aylesbury Nick for 8 hours, eating their pretty awful lasagna. And if you're ever arrested in Aylesbury, don't ask for the lasagna. Trust me. They go for the all-day breakfast. But when they seized my laptop computer without a warrant, they also seized all of the backups that I had in the UK to Spy Hunter, and those backups were only returned to me in December of last year, long after the book was published. So the first draft of Spy Hunter became available to the intelligence community in March, weeks before my arrest. It became available because as I had done the first draft, it had to be sent to publishers, and it could really only be done by email. It didn't matter whether it went by email or a more secure route, because once you give it to publishers, then everybody in the intelligence community is going to know what's in it. So although I had written Spy Hunter in great secrecy, and I had been staying in remote locations in Australia, New Zealand, I was down in Tasmania doing a Peter Wright, keeping an eye out for German spies. Although I wrote the book largely wrote it in remote rural locations and didn't email any of its contents until it was finished. Once it was finished, the security was gone because publishers are then looking at it. And of course, they're going to circulate it to peer reviewers and so forth and so on. So the book became public knowledge. Public knowledge, it became widely known in the intelligence community what I had written. Now, it was fairly explosive and obviously exposed Edward Heath. I dealt with the McCann case, told the truth about the McCann kidnap, put an annex that included my paper for the Joint Intelligence Committee on the McCann kidnap, told the truth about the DVD and the failure to shut down German intelligence in 1945. I wrote about the Kennedy assassination. I wrote about the sabotage of the Challenger and Columbia space shuttles, the Apollo 1 murders. There was the Comet sabotage in 1954.
It's a brilliant read. It really is a brilliant read.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in there.
But what's relevant to this, I think, is Dunblane, the McCanns. And by the way, some of our listeners won't have read Spy Hunter. And their minds are probably going 360 degrees. Their heads are probably spinning. Michael's contention about Madeleine McCann is that she was kidnapped by an elite VIP paedophile ring. There are those researchers, there are those commentators who've asked all sorts of questions over the years about the McCanns. I know nothing about any of that. I'm not getting into any of that. I don't have any opinion because I don't know all the facts. Michael has never said anything about Madeleine and Jerry McCann. Excuse me, Kate and Jerry McCann. Michael's contention was that she was kidnapped by an elite VIP paedophile ring. So I'm just getting that out there in case you're wondering, what did he say? What did he write about the McCanns? That's what he said. But he wrote about Ted Heath and he wrote about Dunblane and Thomas Hamilton. That's what we're going to get into right now. Michael, question for you. I've spent much of the last 18 months, this programme is on air, this particular show is on the air 18 months now, and we spent a lot of time talking about the inquiry into child abuse. We've learned about what happened in Kincora Boys Home in Northern Ireland. We've learned that MI5 knew all about the abuse going on there and that they covered it up. We know this. We know about Haute de la Garenne in Jersey. We know again that children were being murdered, raped, unspeakable things done to children there. And we know that the authorities knew what was going on. It's David Icke's belief, Michael, as you well know, that there is no number that will justify that works in terms of the amounts of children this has happened to. It's happened to tens of thousands. It might even have happened to hundreds of thousands. You are a barrister, my friend. You work amongst learned men and women. You work amongst politicians. Is it accepted amongst your peers, whether they say it out loud or not, whether they say this is happening out loud or not, but do you think it's accepted in your circle, in your group, in your peer group, that this has been and is going on?
I think it's becoming more widely accepted in my legal peer group. It is very much accepted in my intelligence peer group. What I wrote and what David Icke, with whom I respectfully agree on this subject, what David and I have written about Heath is coming to pass. There are now 5 police forces in England investigating separate allegations of sexual abuse by Edward Heath. Those allegations are linked into the Savile paedophile ring, which I said in Spy Hunter was protected by the Cabinet Office and was supplying boys to the then Cabinet Secretary John Hunt as well as Heath. In addition to the investigations in England, there has been a long-running investigation in Jersey. Haute de la Regaine nursing home, by the way, was the wartime headquarters of the German Abwehr, the predecessor of the DVD. I should probably pick you up respectfully in your intro, which is obviously based on media reports of what I had said. When the media said I was blaming Nazi spies for a planned attack on the London Olympics, the media weren't talking to me. No journalist came to me and asked for my version of events. None of the journalists involved, so far as I knew, had actually taken the trouble to read what I had written about the DVD. The DVD are not and never have been Nazis. They're too smart for that. Your average Nazi, Richie, is pretty dumb, or was pretty dumb. The DVD grew out of the Abwehr, who were not Nazi. The Abwehr installed the Nazis. The Abwehr tried to control them, did up until 1938, lost control, then arranged various assassination plots against Hitler. But the Abwehr were not ideological Nazis. They came up with the idea. They wrote the book, Mein Kampf. But although they came up with the idea, wrote the book, and may have designed the uniforms, they were not actual Nazis. They were too bright for that.
That's a whole other area of research that we could spend a whole show on, isn't it? But
exactly.
I want to stick with what Heath was doing, who probably knew about it, how far the cover-up went. And I want to mention this, Michael. We spoke about this earlier on today. It's very important. Our listeners are probably sick of hearing this, but I want to play a 30-second extract from a documentary made by Michael Cockrell, which was broadcast by the BBC in 1995. It's kind of staggering, really. Tim Fortescue, whom Michael will know all about because he was Chief Whip under Ted Heath in 1972-73, I believe. I've not got my notes to hand. I should have, but I'm pretty sure it's around about that time. Tim Fortescue, you're going to hear him here talking about people coming to the whips, politicians coming to the whips in difficulty, in trouble, with issues. And he talks about interfering with small boys. Now, have a listen to this. Michael, we'll be with you in 20 seconds. I'm not sure you'll be able to hear this, but you know what he's saying anyway. Have a listen.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam. Can you help? It might be debt. It might be scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal which a member seemed likely.
They would go to the whips, Michael. It might be a scandal involving debt. It might be a scandal involving small boys. Now, this was broadcast by the BBC in 1995. Fortescue is dead now. The casual nature, Michael, with which he talks about the abuse of small boys, it almost sounds, and of course Fortescue is not here to answer the questions, it almost sounds like it was a pretty regular thing for a politician, an MP, to come to him or to another whip to say, I've been caught buggering small boys, get me out of it. What do you think, Michael?
It would have been, and that's partly how we ended up with the European Communities Act. I'm not sure how many MPs were involved in abuse of underage boys and girls in the period when he was Chief Whip, which you were right, was 71 to 73. But that covers the European Communities Bill, which is very controversial. There was a massive amount of blackmail pressure applied to MPs. I don't know how many MPs were known to the whips as being involved in sex abuse of teenagers and in children as well. By that I mean children under the age of 14. But it was probably 20 to 30. Clearly, Tim Fortescue was covering a whole range of scandals involving MPs. They weren't all involved in abuse of boys. But it was a fair number, and that would include Labour MPs as well. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, was involved in abuse of boys. They were supplied to him by a German intelligence-controlled boys' home in the East End of London, out of Toynbee Hall. It's something that had been going on for a very long time.
By the way, I should say this for our listeners who've not heard you and I talk before. Michael and I have one fundamental disagreement. When Michael says German intelligence, I think what he really means, and it sounds a bit patronising, I certainly don't mean to patronise him because he's obviously a very, very smart man, but I think he mistakes when he says German, I think what he really means is Rothschild Zionists. And that's what I really believe now. We're not going to waste any time arguing about that because we've had this debate several times before, you and I. I absolutely respect your opinion, and that's why you're here. But I don't believe this German thing. I think that what we're talking about is even more sinister. But we're not, there's no point in us arguing about that again, like two bloody rams butting heads on it. We've had these disputes before. Michael, Ian and others please ask Michael Richie as a matter of urgency. Did Ted Heath take us into the EU on unfavourable terms because he was being blackmailed over his paedophilia?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, he wasn't just being blackmailed, he was also on the German payroll. It's now known that he went on the German payroll in 1937. He was initially paid £250 a year in sterling, which was a lot of money for the son of a carpenter at Oxford, Balliol College, Oxford, in the late 1930s. The payments increased substantially after the war, and a lot of them were laundered through Peking. Heath was running Morning Cloud, as one naval intelligence officer pointed out to me. When Heath was running Morning Cloud, the running costs of his boat, never mind the purchase costs, the running costs of the boat were more than he could have earned as leader of the opposition, which I think his salary then was £16,000, and the boat cost more than £16,000 a year to run. It had a crew, and Heath wasn't somebody who knew something about Heath's sailing ability. He pointed out to me many years ago that he wasn't actually that good a sailor. He certainly needed a crew. He couldn't have handled the yacht himself, and if he had tried to handle it himself, it would have sunk. Morning Cloud 4, in fact, did sink after Heath was booted out of office. The Germans pulled the plug on his boat and sank it for him because they were unhappy about the possibility of Britain pulling out of the EEC. That was just prior to the 75 referendum, from memory. But no, Heath was also on the German payroll and was paid substantial amounts. By the end of his life, he was worth a ridiculous amount of money compared to what he could have earned legitimately. So
Heath was abusing boys on a yacht moored in Jersey.
No. The abuse took place. Saville and an associate inside the same ring. Saville was taking boys to the yacht. Indeed, an eyewitness has now come forward to say that she saw one less boy come back from the yacht that had been taken onto the yacht, and thought it odd at the time. And I believe that person has now given a statement to police.
Do you really believe the police are investigating this? I mean, look, let's be honest about it. Are they really looking into the allegations against Edward Heath?
Well, the Metropolitan Police. Now, it's interesting. The Cabinet Office seized control of the police in 1964 with the Police Act 1964. For 50 years plus, we've had Cabinet Office control of the police in this country. But there are signs of some local forces breaking free of Cabinet Office control. Now, the Metropolitan Police are close to the Cabinet Office and always have been. The Met tried to shut the Heath inquiry down, and it was transferred to Wiltshire. Now, Wiltshire have a reputation for being honest, and they're one of the most, in my opinion, they're certainly one of the most honest police forces in Britain. They're also very competent, and it was quite fascinating that Wiltshire were resisting pressure from the Met. And of course, you've not just got the police inquiries in Britain. Jersey is not part of the United Kingdom. It's part of the Dukedom of Normandy. The head of state of Jersey is the Duke of Normandy, who is the Queen, always referred to as the Duke, even when the sovereign is female. You refer to the Duke as the Duke. And Jersey, which is independent of the UK, has run its own police investigation into these murders and into the sexual abuse. And that has been going for some years. The Jersey police have a good reputation. Wiltshire force, which is now the lead force on Heath, has a good reputation. And the more corrupt forces, those that are known to be closer to the Cabinet Office, like the Met, with respect, faded into the background. I believe that the ongoing police inquiries in Britain and Jersey are being conducted in good faith by honest and competent detectives.
Do you really believe they'll be allowed to reach a conclusion that shows that Edward Heath was a child murderer and abuser, and that not only was he at it, but you mentioned Clement Attlee there. We could name, we won't of course, we can name the dead ones, but the ones who are still alive that are suspected, we won't say anything. Because it's always been my contention that this is the ultimate taboo, Michael, in terms of the electorate, in terms of ordinary men like me, ordinary men and women. If people find out this, Michael, and how deep this goes, the apparatus of the state collapses because people won't have it. They won't have it, Michael.
What will collapse is Britain's membership of the European Union, because it's likely to be highly damaging to the yes case in the forthcoming referendum for Heath to be publicly exposed as having been blackmailed over the sexual abuse and murder of teenage boys in the run-up to the entry into the EEC on terms which are dictated by Germany, who were, of course, paying Heath. Apart from anything
in that
else,
sense, you're right about Germany, by the way. I'm not going to argue with you on that. You're absolutely right about Germany there.
Heath being on the German payroll, along with Sir Geoffrey Rippon, Heath and Rippon were the signatories to the Treaty of Brussels, which took Britain into the EEC. And under international law, if a state corrupts the signatories of another state, that state is not bound by the signatures. And Britain's commitment to the European Union is voidable under international law. Yes, the consequences are large. I don't believe any of the police forces in Britain or Jersey would be allowed to reach a conclusion before the referendum, and there would obviously be heavy pressure on them to tone down and water down their inquiries. That is a problem with official inquiries. At some point, somebody in Britain is going to have to understand that if the public could have any confidence at all in any official inquiry, one of them is going to have to start telling the truth. We've seen enough whitewashes. We saw the Cohen inquiry on the Comets, which is a ludicrous whitewash, which came to the conclusion that de Havilland Comets had been negligently designed without there being any negligence. It was just utter nonsense.
It was ludicrous. I'm going to mention a few quick tweets and then I want to get on to Dunblane. Number of people saying, Richie, don't forget the Rothschilds came from Frankfurt and their power and wealth was built in Germany. That's right.
Exactly.
It's my contention. Yeah, we've had this out before.
There are basically three branches of the Rothschild family. You've got your nice Rothschilds, who are British, and then you've got your French Rothschilds, who are not so nice, and then you've got your German Rothschilds, and I'm afraid they're German.
Let's not have an argument now, you and I, because we're mates, and I'm not going to be picking on my mate who's not long out of prison. We fundamentally disagree on this. The Rothschilds own every central bank in the world, bar a couple. The banking scandals, the creation of money itself is another show. We could be here all day long, and which ultimately enslaves every single one of us. And again, we could be here all day, but I want to read out some of these tweets. A number of listeners want to take issue with your contention about honest police forces. I must point out there are victims of paedophilia listening to this programme.
Yes.
They're enjoying Michael, but they're saying, Michael, we don't believe for a minute there's any such thing as an honest police force. They're never, ever going to properly investigate this because of what it would do. Number of people are trying to get me and you to have another row. Number of people are saying, how did Savile get so close to the royal family? Richie, how did British intelligence ever allow that? Now, again, Michael and myself have argued about this in the past. We have different opinions on that. It's very, very, very serious. Michael Shrimpton, here's a question for you. Number of people have been on this programme since you were in prison, from different places in the world, from Australia, from North America, from South America, credible men and women who talk about a satanic element or satanic rituals going on when they were abused and the abuse they witnessed. Now, David published on davidicke.com /headlines today a story about a charity whose name just escapes me this second, but it's a credible charity who has kind of broken water and who is saying, this charity, that they're finding more and more and more and more victims talking about satanic ritualistic abuse. Is this something you've come across?
Yes, satanic, there's no doubt there's a satanic element. But the caveat I would raise is this. These paedophile rings have been organised by intelligence agencies. Normally, intelligence officers are not, they tend to be pretty bright. You can't be a player in the intelligence community with an IQ less than 150. To be a major player, your starting point is 175. These guys don't necessarily believe in Satanism. They don't necessarily believe in Satan. But the ritual is a convenient excuse to get people's clothes off. It's a convenient cover for abuse. And of course, some of the people, the politicians and future leaders and so on, the people who went along to Bohemian Grove, Richard Nixon, you name it, some of these people may be foolish enough, not Nixon being the exception, he was quite bright for a president. Some of these people may be foolish enough to believe in Satan, and they may go along with the belief system. The people running the show do not. But it's a very, very convenient exercise. It's a very convenient justification.
Now, we disagree there again. I believe the people running the show do. And you'll know that this is a central theory of David Icke's as well.
Yes.
And I agree with David on this. Not because I've got my tongue up David's, behind, because I've come to understand and believe this. I thought it was ridiculous for a long time, and I would have mocked it. But that we disagree on this. I'm only pointing that out just, in the interest of balance, and because I want the listeners to know that I absolutely respect what you're saying, because I know it's what you believe. And that's all that matters to me, is that your opinion is your own opinion. You are saying what it is that you believe, and I will die for that. Too many people in public life, like yourself, or in positions like yourself, not saying what it is they believe. Saying whatever it is that they're paid to say or that they're told to say. Your opinions are your own, yeah.
Exactly, and I would prefer to use the word analysis. That is my analysis. That's my considered view. It's not so much a question of belief. What is the evidence?
It's what you've seen.
What inferences do we draw from the evidence? We're trying in the intelligence community, and I'm no longer a member of the intelligence community, but when I was, we were trying to get at the truth, because intelligence is about speaking truth to power. In answer to the earlier tweet, it probably is an exaggeration to say there are honest police forces in Britain, but there are certainly honest policemen and women. And I think you will find that on the Heath investigation, certainly at the coalface, you've got honest coppers doing their best to get at the truth. And I have it's certainly been the occasional conversation with officers not a million miles removed from the investigation who attract my professional admiration and respect. The majority of policemen and women in Britain are honest. The problem is that because their forces are controlled from the Cabinet Office, the ethics of the
absolutely, and they end up going down blind alleys, don't they?
Dragged down to the ethical level.
Of course,
the police have been dragged down to the ethial level of the civil service, so it's down in the gutter. It's pretty low, and that is a tragedy, because in Britain we used to have the finest police in the world, going back as recently as the 1950s. The public had great confidence in the police, and the police were a source of national pride. Now they're a source of national shame.
Embarrassment. We've 10 minutes left, by the way, and I want to get into two things in the 10 minutes. Question number one. It's my considered opinion, with no evidence to back it up. I have no evidence. It's my considered opinion that Greville Janner was murdered. Lord Janner, I believe, and I know this can be done. I've had the misfortune over the years to talk to a couple of men, former military men, who ended up working for themselves, doing nasty things, basically either working as mercenaries in various conflicts in Africa and elsewhere, but sometimes killing people for money. Oh yeah, yes. I've met some scumbags, and I know you have as well.
Yes, indeed.
Greville Janner was given a little injection that maybe he didn't even feel, or he was given a little tablet that he didn't even know he was getting, and his heart stopped and he died. Because there was nothing wrong with Greville Janner. Nothing wrong with him. Only weeks ago, Greville Janner was still attending the House of Lords and picking up his cheque for doing it. It's my belief that Greville Janner, that the system could not bear the idea of him being questioned under caution. I might sound like I'm contradicting myself now, having criticised the police, but where are you with Greville Janner and his mysterious death? Not to mention Leon Britton, none of us knew he had cancer either. What do you think?
No. Well, I haven't had a look at Greville Janner's death in detail, so I think the best answer I can give, and not being funny, the best answer I can give is that I can't express a concluded view because I've not considered the evidence. I wouldn't rule out murder. I think he was ill. I think he was in certainly the early stages of Alzheimer's. I don't believe, but like you, I don't believe he was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. And certainly he was conducting corporate business and business in the House of Lords, comparatively recently.
November.
It wasn't. Well, yes, it was. The timeline. I don't have the timeline in front of me. I don't think he was end stage Alzheimer's. I suspect that his illness was being exaggerated a little bit. It often is when people are facing serious criminal charges. And of course, the burden of the proceedings may have had would have had an adverse impact on his health anyway. He was a nice man. I say that we only met, perhaps a couple of times. I might see him in the House of Lords if I had business there and say hello. He was a perfectly pleasant man. I have to say the allegations against him are probably not without substance.
There's so many of them. There's a couple of dozen at least.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. You see, there are so many, and there's so much similar fact there that
so much detail there. Yeah,
it's very difficult to conclude that there was nothing going on. Indeed, it was known that the girl had a predilection for underage boys. That nothing about the charges against him took me particularly by surprise.
Was he protected by, amongst others, the Mossad? We've been asked questions about that. Look, obviously people who worked around him and knew him, British men and women, knew what he was up to. There's no doubt in my mind. But was there an Israeli element in Janner getting away with it?
I doubt it. I mean, Mossad, I've worked with Mossad. They're awfully nice people.
Don't start me now.
Mossad, I certainly don't think Mossad murdered him. If he was murdered, I'm not sure he was murdered. I'd say I haven't got a concluded view on that.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that. I was suggesting maybe he was being protected. Yeah.
He certainly, to my knowledge, had his contacts with the Mossad. It would be very surprising if he hadn't. He was a distinguished British Jew, professional man. He certainly would have had some contact, either direct or indirect, with the Mossad, probably mostly indirect contact. He was very well informed, and he certainly knew where a few skeletons were buried. And I don't think this is one of the problems with putting him on trial, that he knew where so many skeletons were buried in the Labour Party. Knew about paedophiles in the Labour Party, Labour politicians using rent boys, the Dunblane massacre, the background to that. He was well informed, and some of his knowledge may have come from his Mossad contacts. I wouldn't rule that out.
Michael, I'm going to stop you on that now, because we agreed that we would do till the very latest, till 20 minutes to the top of the hour. We're going to stick to that. So I'll say we've got another 5 or 6 minutes. The reason I'm stopping you there is because I want to talk about Thomas Hamilton. I didn't realise today when you and I were talking, because mind goes around in circles when you're reading newspapers and stuff. I didn't realise that we're actually very, very close to the 20th anniversary of the shootings in Dunblane. I remember where I was when I learned what had happened in Dunblane. I think anybody who was alive then, I would have been 18 years old at the time, 19 years old. I would have been a bit older than that. Maybe I was a bit older, actually. Maybe I was 22 years old when I heard that 16 children and a teacher were murdered by Thomas Hamilton in Dunblane. There was an inquiry, as a Cullen report, a lot of issues with the findings of that particular report, of course. Michael, you've had a lot to say on this. Who was Thomas Hamilton and what really happened in Dunblane?
Well, Thomas Hamilton was, you're right, the anniversary comes up on the 13th of next month. Thomas Hamilton was close to GO2, the German operation in London. He was supplying boys, many of them coming out of a school where army officers' children were sent to. He was supplying boys to politicians, judges, and senior policemen in Scotland. And there's no doubt when you supply boys to figures at that level that you're going to be involved with GO2. He's another one who was almost certainly protected by the Cabinet Office and to some extent obviously the Scottish Office as well. But the Scottish Office works quite closely with the Cabinet Office. He had heavy duty protection in Edinburgh. He knew where a great many skeletons were buried. There's no doubt that he was murdered, and I've said so in Spy Hunter. He was murdered by officers of Scotland Central Police. The official version of events that he shot himself through the roof of the mouth of the 357 Magnum and was still alive several minutes later. I think I said in Spy Hunter.
Ridiculous.
I wouldn't encourage anyone to try it at home. If you shoot yourself through the roof of your mouth with a 357 Magnum, I think it was, you're going to be dead instantaneously. You're not going to be alive for very long. And there is almost no possibility of you surviving that. That is as good a method of killing yourself as any. The roof of the mouth is not very strong, and the 357 Magnum is very powerful. And of course, when you fire off a gun, you've got expanding gases, which are very hot. It's not quite instantaneous, and if you try it, I wouldn't recommend any listener to try it, but if you do try it, it's not a necessarily painless way of dying. Instantaneous is probably an exaggeration. It's going to feel a bit longer. It will feel longer than it takes. But on any view, you're going to be dead within a matter of seconds. You're not going to be thrashing around alive a few minutes later.
Certainly not.
The problem is that the Magnum is such a big gun, you're not going to miss. You can't put a gun in your mouth and miss your brain. It doesn't matter whether you're firing it to the side or not. You're going to get chunk. You're going to get a chunk of your brain, whichever angle you've got the gun at. There's only you've got a limited traverse for a gun that big inside the human mouth. So the official version of events just bears no scrutiny at all. Nobody in the intelligence community with a brain, and you have to have a brain to be in the intelligence community,
would buy it.
It would buy it.
Why were those children murdered, Michael?
Well, it looks as though Hamilton went berserk. He was very annoyed about not getting access to firearms, to which he was used, because he had so many. He had so much material on senior police officers, judges, and so on. He was certainly someone who lost the plot. He was obviously very angry, to put it mildly. He went out and murdered a class of school children and one of their teachers. It looks as though it doesn't look as though he was asked to go out and do the killings. I don't think for one moment that the killings themselves were organized. He goes berserk. Somebody realizes, oh God, we've got to get rid of him. We can't have him surviving. There was no question, I think, that he would be permitted to live. He was taken out.
But wasn't he abusing boys in Loch Lomond? He was an abuser of children, wasn't he?
Yes, I'm sure he was. Yeah, yes. The critical thing is not that he himself was an abuser. That was bad enough. But the problem is that he was supplying boys to senior figures in Scotland. It's a huge scandal.
So you can conclude, or you can draw the conclusion, as many have, that the children were being murdered to silence them.
I don't think the children were being murdered to silence the children. The children, none of the children he murdered was being, as far as I know, was the victim of abuse. The children, in fact, they weren't necessarily from that school. There was another school where it was a boarding school. It's the Victoria boarding school in it's been some time since I wrote about Dunblane, and listeners will have to forgive me. The file on Dunblane, my file on Dunblane, was opened in 1996, and it's been some time since I worked on it. But there was a school where the Ministry of Defence sponsored boys, a boarding school, and it was that school where the boys were coming from. They weren't necessarily coming from the primary school. And of course,
Dunblane. That's what I was just going to say. That there's two trains of thought. There's a train of thought that some of the kids were part of a paedophile ring. That's one theory, but the prevailing theory is that Hamilton was some sort of a Manchurian candidate because he had to be moved aside because of what he knew and whom he had been abusing children with, the company he was keeping. But that's a bizarre way then to take him out. You know, why kill all those children at the same time?
Well, I think the decision to have a murder spree was Hamilton's. I think Hamilton suspected he was about to be bumped off. This is one of the problems of GO2. They'll take out their own people very willingly. Hamilton knew he was dealing with some very dangerous people. Once he was refused access to firearms, or once there was any thought of taking his guns away, I think he would have got very, very nervous and would have read into that, oh dear, I'm about to be hit. So I suspect that he was frightened. I suspect that he was very angry. And I say he lost the plot. Absolutely tragic for the kiddies concerned and their parents and families. Tragic for Scotland, and tragic for the people of Dunblane, including one wonderful tennis player who survived the trauma and has grown into be the finest tennis player in the world if you discount Novak Djokovic.
Yeah, of course, if he wasn't playing. The Cullen inquiry locked or sealed documents away for a century. When they were put under a bit of pressure, some documents were released, but they weren't that important. But still, a lot of evidence that is vital in terms of proving or disproving some of the theories about what happened have been kept and will be kept hidden from public glare for over a century. I mean, this is outrageous, really, isn't it?
Well, it's wrong, with great respect to Lord Cullen. And the trouble is, the minute you start sealing documents for a century, then people are going to get suspicious. Sometimes when documents are sealed, when they're eventually made available, they turn out not to be that suspicious at all. I've certainly had that situation as a barrister where prosecution are hiding documents documents, you eventually get to see them, and they're not that. There's not actually a lot in them, and you wonder why on earth they bothered. The problem with sealing documents is that it's bound to raise suspicion. I haven't seen the documents, of course, they're sealed, but my view is that those documents should be made public. Banning them from public view for a century was quite wrong with respect to Lord Cullen, and I respectfully reject the conclusions of his report.
We're just about at the end of our time, Michael. Thanks for coming back on the programme. It's been a long time coming. I'm just going to read out a couple of quick comments on Dunblane. Ian was on to say, I think the Dunblane kids were being abused and were reaching age where they were starting to talk about it. That's what he says. It's possible. Martin was on to say that Martin thinks that Hamilton might have been subject to mind control. Now, we all know about MK Ultra, and you know all about MK Ultra and some of the mind control programs that intelligence agencies like the CIA have definitely been running for a long, long time. It's a possibility. The thing is, and Michael has said this earlier on as well, you know, these might be very, very plausible scenarios. The problem always lies in the burden of proof. It's so difficult to prove these things without having access. Shona was on to say, good grief, the rot goes so deep, doesn't it? It appears it is all starting to unravel, which can only be a good thing, I say. And Michael Shrimpton, you have the last word. Is it starting to unravel, Michael? Are we ever going to find out in a timely fashion the extent within the establishment that this terrible abuse and murder of children goes to, the extent of it? Are we ever in a timely fashion in our lifetimes going to uncover what's going on?
I think we will. I think the Cabinet Office grip on the country is starting to weaken. There are very encouraging signs that the referendum on the EU will be won, which will be a huge start. It'll only be a start, mind you. And I think there is increasing pressure on GO2 and on the German electronics company, which runs the telephone tapping centre in London, which supplies GO2 with most of its blackmail material on judges, politicians, senior civil servants, senior police officers, and in some cases, sadly, military officers. That blackmail operation has to be shut down. GO2 has to be shut down. And we need constitutional reform. We need to break up the power of the Cabinet Office. We need to let government departments run their own affairs without Cabinet Office interference. We need to restore ministerial responsibility. We need to have ministers properly responsible to the elected parliament for policy. We must stop having policy made in the Cabinet Office, and we must stop the unending supply of blackmail material to the Cabinet Office from GO2.
I want to say this, and we're going to leave it there, right here. Again, I think I can say this to you more than anybody, because I don't think, you know, you're not somebody I don't think who scares easily. I'd still be very careful if I was you, mate. I'd be careful about what I ate. I mean it. You know,
no, I'm careful.
Be careful. You know, when you're out watching your local cricket team play and you decide to have a glass of champagne or a glass of wine, I'd be very careful about it. I just keep my eyes in the back of my head for the foreseeable future. You might be out of prison, but
I always prefer to pour my own glass of champagne, and I never stand close to the edge of the platform as the tube train comes in. Now, the intelligence world wasn't entirely safe. I survived the one assassination attempt that was made on me in '99 by the DVD. I've kept alive up until now. I plan on being around for a year or two yet. One thing I shouldn't have said, which I want to say, is that one has to be very, very careful, coming back to these allegations, very careful of deliberately false allegations, which are then exposed and then reflect or in some way damage allegations.
You're talking about Bramall, particularly.
Yes, I've met Bramall. He's a lovely man, and I don't believe a word of what is being said.
Can you just qualify that just before you say goodbye? Michael believes, as we believe, that the system will put out allegations that are absolutely preposterous and ludicrous, allegations which are bound to fall flat, so that the system can point and go, it's all a bloody hoax, it's all a bloody witch hunt. It's what you said to me today.
It's what I call them the Niger yellow cake phenomenon. It's the old ploy. It's a standard intelligence ploy. It's long associated with the Abwehr, with the DBD, and with GO2. in order to damage credible intelligence, you put somebody who isn't credible to make patently false allegations which say the same thing. Everybody then jumps. There's a danger that people jump on the bandwagon. You then blow the false allegations out of the water, and you damage the true allegations at the same time. It's an old ploy. It was disgracefully used by GO2 and the Met against Lord Bramall, who's a fine man, a distinguished officer whose career goes back to D-Day. I've met with Bramall. I don't believe for one moment that he was involved in anything criminal at all. The allegations against him were scandalous. They should never have been investigated. They were wholly lacking in corroboration. And I believe the Met should not only apologise, but should pay Lord Bramall substantial damages. They should pay his lordship massive damages. And I think it's extremely important not to jump on bandwagons, to look at allegations on their merits, and not to assume just because someone is a member of the establishment, and field marshals, difficult to be a field marshal and not be a member of the establishment, not to assume that they're guilty just because a police force is running around investigating them.
Michael, terrific to talk to you again after all this time. Glad you're doing well and you're hale and hearty. Good luck to you and your partner. Keep us posted with these events, with what you're hearing, what you're finding out, and of course keep us posted about your pending appearance at the European Court of Human Rights, going back to the conviction. Real pleasure, mate. Thanks for coming back on.
Well done. Cheers.
Look after yourself. Bye for now. Michael Shrimpton, the author of Spy Hunter. The barrister and the intelligence expert on the line to us from his home.